My husband's family always treated me as an outsider, but when they tried to control our lives, I finally fought back. Hey Reddit, I'm Emily, 34, and I've been married to my husband, Mark, 36, for almost 10 years. I've always had a rocky relationship with Mark's family, his mom, Linda, 58, and his sister, Chloe, 31. They've never truly accepted me, and I've always felt like an outsider. Recently, things reached a breaking point when Mark's family tried to take control of our lives, and I finally decided enough was enough. Here's how it all went down and how I'm slowly reclaiming my peace. Mark and I met 12 years ago at a mutual friend's wedding. He was the groomsman who couldn't stop cracking jokes during the reception, and I was the bridesmaid who was trying to keep a straight face. We hit it off instantly, bonding over our shared sense of humor and love for good food. We went on our first date the very next week, and from there, we were inseparable. Mark was charming, kind, and always knew how to make me laugh. He was the kind of guy who remembered the little things, like how I took my coffee or the song I'd been humming absent-mindedly. Within a year, we moved in together, and 2 years later, he proposed on a quiet beach in the Bahamas during a surprise getaway. I remember thinking that this was the happiest I'd ever been, and I couldn't wait to start our lives together. But there was one aspect of Mark's life that I wasn't prepared for: his family. From the beginning, Mark had warned me that his mom, Linda, could be a bit much. She was the quintessential overbearing mother, always inserting herself into Mark's life and never quite letting go of the reins. Mark's dad had passed away when he was a teenager, and Linda had raised him and his younger sister, Chloe, on her own. She was fiercely protective of her kids, but her protectiveness often crossed the line into control. I met Linda for the first time at a family dinner, and it was clear from the start that she wasn't thrilled about me. She greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and spent most of the evening grilling me about my job, my family, and my intentions with her son. It felt less like a welcome and more like an interrogation, but I brushed it off, telling myself that she was just being protective. Linda's house was filled with old family photos, Mark's baby pictures, his school achievements, and Chloe's endless graduation photos, but there were no signs of anyone else in their lives. It was as if they'd built a world just for the three of them, and any outsider, like me, was seen as a threat. Chloe, on the other hand, was a different story. She was 3 years younger than Mark and still lived at home with Linda. Chloe was pretty, polished, and always put together, but she had an attitude that could cut through steel. She worked as a fashion buyer, and while she had a glamorous job and an active social life, she was still very much under Linda's thumb. Chloe had a way of making snide comments disguised as compliments, and every interaction with her felt like a passive-aggressive battle. I remember one particular evening when Mark and I went over for dinner, and Chloe was there, dressed impeccably as always. She had my outfit, a simple floral dress that I'd worn to work, and gave me a once-over. "Cute dress, Emily," she said, her tone dripping with fake sweetness. Very practical. It was these little digs, always delivered with a smile, that made me feel constantly judged and out of place. At first, I tried my best to get along with Mark's family. I'd invite Linda over for dinner, make an effort to ask Chloe about her job, and always show up to family gatherings with a smile. I knew how much they meant to Mark, and I wanted to be part of that world. But no matter what I did, it always felt like I was an outsider looking in. Linda and Chloe had a tight-knit bond, and they never let me forget that I wasn't really part of their circle. One Thanksgiving, Linda made a point of reminding everyone that the stuffing recipe she'd been using for years was Mark's favorite. "I'm sure it's not as fancy as what Emily usually makes," she said, casting a sideways glance at me, "but it's tradition." Everyone laughed, but I could feel the sting of her words. It was little comments like that, always finding ways to belittle me, that made me feel like I'd never be good enough for their family. Mark tried to smooth things over, insisting that Linda and Chloe just needed time to adjust. "They're not used to having someone else around," he'd say, rubbing my back reassuringly. "But they'll come around. Just give them time." I wanted to believe him, but as the years went by, it became clear that Linda and Chloe had no intention of accepting me. There were also those awkward family vacations where I was always on edge. Mark and I once joined them on a trip to Lake Tahoe, thinking it would be a chance to bond. But from the start, I was sidelined. Linda planned every detail without consulting me, from the cabin arrangements to the activities, and Chloe spent the whole trip talking about old family memories I wasn't a part of. Even the photos they took always of the family seemed to exclude me. It was a subtle, painful reminder that I was always on the outside looking in. The tension between me and Mark's family reached a boiling point during our wedding planning. From the moment we got engaged, Linda and Chloe tried to take control of every aspect of the wedding. Linda wanted a big, traditional church ceremony with a grand reception, while Chloe insisted on being my maid of honor despite our rocky relationship. I had always imagined a small, intimate beach wedding, but it quickly became clear that my vision didn't matter. Linda called me almost daily with suggestions, which were really just demands. She wanted us to use her florist, her caterer, and even her hairdresser. When I pushed back, suggesting something different, she'd get defensive, acting as though I was rejecting her completely. "This is what Mark would want," she'd say, as if she knew him better than I did. Chloe would back her up, criticizing every choice I made and constantly comparing it to what she thought would be better. The wedding dress was another battleground. I'd found a beautiful, simple gown that I fell in love with, but when Linda saw it, she scrunched her nose. "It's lovely, but don't you think something a bit more glamorous would suit you better?" she said, clearly unimpressed. Chloe chimed in, suggesting I try on the dress she'd worn as a bridesmaid at her friend's wedding. "It's a classic," she insisted. I was baffled. Why would I want to wear Chloe's dress on my wedding day? One weekend, Linda insisted on taking us to a venue she loved, a grand ballroom with crystal chandeliers and gold accents. It was beautiful, but it wasn't me. I wanted something more personal, something that reflected who Mark and I were as a couple. But Linda wouldn't hear it. "This is perfect," she declared, already picturing the event in her mind. "It's elegant, timeless. Your guests will love it." I tried to assert myself, to remind everyone that this was my wedding, but my voice kept getting drowned out. Mark, caught between his mom and me, tried to be a mediator. "Let's just keep an open mind," he'd say, trying to placate both sides. But every time he caved to Linda's demands, I felt a little piece of myself slipping away. The final straw came when I found out that Linda had booked a wedding photographer behind my back. I'd already chosen someone whose style I loved, more candid, capturing the genuine moments rather than just posed shots, but Linda decided it wasn't traditional enough and went ahead with her own plans. Mark and I had a huge fight about it. He was stuck in the middle, trying to please everyone, and ended up siding with his mom to keep the peace. I was furious, not just at Linda, but at Mark for not standing up for me. On the day of our wedding, I felt like a guest at my own event. Linda was everywhere, giving orders to the caterers, adjusting table settings, and even trying to direct the photographer. During the reception, she gave a speech that was less about us as a couple and more about her family's traditions. "I've always imagined Mark's wedding day," she began, beaming with pride. "I'm just so glad it turned out just like I'd hoped." It was as if she was taking credit for the entire day, and I was just a supporting player in her script. Chloe spent the night flitting around, chatting with guests and dropping hints about how she'd love to be next down the aisle. She made sure everyone knew she was the unofficial wedding planner, pointing out all the details she'd helped with and basking in the compliments. I tried to enjoy the day, to focus on the fact that I was marrying the man I loved, but the shadow of Linda and Chloe hung over every moment. After the wedding, Mark and I moved into a house a few miles away from his mom. I thought having our own space would help, but Linda and Chloe were still constantly involved in our lives. They'd drop by unannounced, rearrange things in our house, and criticize our choices. I tried to set boundaries, but every time I did, it would cause a huge blow-up. Mark was torn between his loyalty to his family and his commitment to me. He'd grown up with Linda calling the shots, and it was hard for him to push back. "That's just how they are," he'd say whenever I complained. "You just have to ignore it." But ignoring it wasn't helping. I felt like I was constantly walking on eggshells, trying to keep the peace while slowly losing myself in the process. The first real cracks in my relationship with Mark's family started to show when we decided to buy our first home together. Mark and I had been saving for years, scrimping and cutting back to afford a down payment. It was a small, cozy house in a nice neighborhood, and we were excited to finally have a place to call our own. But Linda and Chloe had other ideas. From the moment we started house hunting, Linda insisted on tagging along to every showing. She'd walk through each house with a critical eye, pointing out every flaw and insisting that we needed to buy something bigger, something more impressive. "You need to think long term," she'd say. "This place isn't big enough if you plan on having kids." Chloe, of course, backed her up. "Yeah, you don't want to end up stuck in some tiny starter home," she'd chime in. "You should be looking at something with more curb appeal." One weekend, we found a charming little bungalow that we both loved. It was modest but had character, with a beautiful garden and enough space for just the two of us. I could already picture us having breakfast on the back patio, enjoying lazy Sunday mornings in our own little haven. But as soon as Linda saw it, she wrinkled her nose. "This is cute," she said, barely masking her disdain, "but you can do better." Linda kept pushing for us to go bigger, promising that she'd help with the down payment. It was a generous offer, but it came with strings attached. Linda wanted us to buy a house in her neighborhood, just a few blocks away. She said it would be easier for her to help with future grandkids, but I knew it was really about control. Mark and I had a huge argument about it. He saw it as a way to finally afford our dream home, while I saw it as another way for Linda to keep us under her thumb. Against my better judgment, I agreed to accept Linda's help, and we ended up buying a bigger house than we'd originally planned. It was beautiful, with a spacious backyard and room for a family, but the price tag made me anxious. I felt like we'd been pressured into something we couldn't fully afford, and the thought of being so close to Linda was suffocating. From the moment we moved in, it became clear that this wasn't just our home, it was an extension of Linda's influence. She'd drop by almost daily, often without calling, to offer helpful advice on everything from our landscaping to how we arranged our furniture. One afternoon, I came home to find Linda rearranging the living room. She'd moved our couch, swapped out the throw pillows, and even hung a new set of curtains she'd picked out without consulting me. "I thought these would brighten up the space," she said cheerfully, as if she'd done me a huge favor. It felt like she was trying to manage our household, and I was losing my mind. Chloe was no better. She'd show up unannounced with her dog, letting it run wild in our backyard and tracking mud into the house. She'd make snarky comments about my decorating style, suggesting I should let Linda help me make the place look more polished. It was like our home wasn't really ours, it was just an extension of Linda and Chloe's domain. The financial pressure started to weigh on us, too. With the bigger mortgage, we had to tighten our budget even more. I clipped coupons, shop sales, and cut back wherever I could, but it never felt like enough. Mark picked up extra hours at work, and I started to feel like we were living paycheck to paycheck, trapped in a house that was supposed to be our dream but was quickly becoming a nightmare. One evening, after yet another unsolicited visit from Linda, I snapped. "This isn't her house." I yelled at Mark. "I'm tired of her showing up whenever she feels like it and telling us what to do. I need space. We need space." Mark looked exhausted. He'd been caught in the middle for so long, trying to keep everyone happy, but it was clear that the situation was taking a toll on him too. "I know," he said quietly. "But what do you want me to do? She helped us with the house. We owe her." Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. We owed her. It was exactly what I'd feared, that by accepting Linda's help, we'd given her control over our lives. I felt trapped, stuck in a situation where I couldn't set boundaries without feeling like I was betraying Mark. I loved him, but his inability to stand up to his family was driving a wedge between us. We spent weeks barely speaking, each conversation turning into a blame game. I accused Mark of letting his family run our lives, while he defended Linda, saying she was just trying to be helpful. It was like we were speaking different languages, and no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't see eye to eye. I started to dread coming home, knowing that Linda or Chloe could show up at any moment, turning our supposed sanctuary into yet another battleground. As if Linda and Chloe's constant interference wasn't enough, the pressure to have children started to ramp up soon after we moved into the new house. I'd always wanted kids, but I wanted to do it on my own terms, when the time was right. But Linda had other ideas. She started dropping not-so-subtle hints every time we saw her, asking when we were going to start our family and reminding us that the clock was ticking. "It's time, you know," Linda would say during Sunday dinners. "You've got the house now, and you're not getting any younger. I'd love to have a little grandbaby running around." Linda would constantly bring up examples of her friends who were already grandparents, flaunting their pictures and gushing about how fulfilling their lives were. She'd bring up Mark's childhood, reminiscing about the joys of raising him and Chloe, and subtly suggesting that I was depriving her of those experiences all over again. Chloe would jump in, talking about how she was considering having kids soon and how it would be great if the cousins were close in age. It was all hypothetical on her end. Chloe wasn't even in a serious relationship, but she loved to act like she had everything figured out. She'd post on social media about her future family plans, tagging Mark and me in posts about the joys of sibling bonds. It felt like she was trying to publicly shame us into following her lead. The pressure reached its peak one Sunday when Linda showed up with a box full of baby clothes she'd found on sale. She laid them out on our dining room table like some kind of bizarre offering. "I couldn't resist," she said, smiling brightly. "Just a little something for when the time comes. I'm sure it'll be soon." I stared at the tiny onesies and pastel blankets, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. It wasn't just the pressure to have kids, it was the assumption that she had a say in such a deeply personal decision. I looked at Mark, hoping he'd finally say something, but he just sat there, silent and uncomfortable. Mark and I had talked about having kids, but we weren't ready. The house was already stretching our finances, and the constant pressure from Linda and Chloe was only adding stress to our relationship. I could see Mark struggling with it, feeling torn between wanting to make his mom happy and wanting to take things at our own pace. One night, after another exhausting dinner at Linda's, Mark brought up the idea of starting a family sooner than we'd planned. "Maybe it's not such a bad idea," he said hesitantly. "It might take some of the pressure off if we just go for it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Are you serious?" I snapped. "We're barely managing as it is, and you want to add a baby to the mix just to make your mom happy?" Mark tried to backtrack, but the damage was done. It felt like Linda's influence was creeping into every aspect of our lives, and I was reaching my breaking point. I wanted kids, but I wanted it to be our decision, not something we were pressured into by his overbearing family. Linda's interference wasn't just limited to casual comments, she began to orchestrate situations that would put us on the spot. At a family barbecue, she invited several of her friends who were grandparents. They spent the afternoon fawning over their grandkids, making not-so-subtle remarks about how Mark and I would be next. Linda even went so far as to pull Mark aside, telling him how she'd already picked out a crib set that would be perfect for our future nursery. I could see the exhaustion on Mark's face, but he just nodded along, too worn down to fight back. The constant meddling started to take a toll on our marriage. We'd argue more frequently, often about things that seemed trivial but were really just symptoms of the larger issue, Linda and Chloe's relentless control over our lives. I tried to talk to Mark about setting boundaries, but every time I brought it up, it turned into a fight. "You just don't get it," he'd say, frustration in his voice. "My mom's been through a lot. She's just trying to help." But it didn't feel like help. It felt like control. I was tired of feeling like an outsider in my own life, tired of constantly having to defend myself against Linda and Chloe's intrusions. I wanted Mark to see things from my perspective, to understand how much their behavior was hurting us, but he was too caught up in his own guilt and loyalty to his family. I started to pull away, emotionally and physically. I'd spend more time at work, volunteering for extra projects just to avoid going home. When I was home, I'd retreat to our bedroom, burying myself in books or binge-watching TV shows to escape the reality of our situation. I knew it wasn't healthy, but I didn't know how else to cope. The final straw came when Linda showed up one afternoon with a nursery catalog, insisting that we start picking out baby furniture just in case. I was livid, but Mark tried to play it off as a joke. "She's just excited," he said, trying to smooth things over. But it wasn't funny. It was invasive and manipulative, and I was done being polite about it. "This is our life, Mark," I said, my voice shaking with frustration. "Not hers. I'm not going to live like this anymore." After years of biting my tongue and trying to keep the peace, I finally reached my breaking point. I couldn't keep living under the shadow of Linda and Chloe's expectations, and I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. I knew that if I didn't stand up for myself, nothing would ever change. The first thing I did was sit down with Mark and lay everything out on the table. I told him how I'd been feeling, how his family's constant interference was suffocating me, how the pressure to have a baby was driving me crazy, and how I felt like I was losing myself in the process. I didn't hold back, and for the first time, I saw the impact of my words hit him. "I never wanted it to be like this," I said, tears welling up. "I love you, Mark, but I can't keep living like this. Your mom and Chloe are ruining our marriage, and I need you to see that." Mark looked devastated. He'd always known there were issues, but hearing it all laid out so clearly was a wake-up call. He promised to talk to his mom and set boundaries, but I wasn't convinced. We'd had similar conversations before, and nothing had changed. The real test came a few days later when Linda and Chloe dropped by unannounced again. This time, instead of retreating to the bedroom or biting my tongue, I took a deep breath and stood my ground. Linda had just started in on another unsolicited piece of advice about how we should redecorate the living room when I interrupted her. "Linda, I appreciate your input, but this is our home," I said firmly. "I need you to respect that. We'll make decisions that are best for us, and we need some space to do that without constant interference." Linda looked taken aback, and Chloe's jaw practically hit the floor. They weren't used to me pushing back, and it was clear that they didn't like it. But I didn't care. For the first time in years, I felt like I was reclaiming a piece of myself. Linda tried to argue, insisting that she was just trying to help, but I didn't back down. "I know you mean well, but this isn't working for us," I said. "We need to set some boundaries, and I need you to respect that." Mark, to his credit, backed me up. He stood by my side, echoing my words and finally putting his foot down with his mom. It wasn't an easy conversation, and it ended with Linda storming out in tears and Chloe giving us the cold shoulder. But it was a start, and it was a moment I'd been waiting for. In the days that followed, things were tense. Linda and Chloe were clearly upset, and Mark was caught in the crossfire. I felt guilty for causing a rift, but I knew it was necessary. I'd spent too long sacrificing my own happiness to keep the peace, and I was done. I started setting more boundaries, declining invitations to family dinners when I knew they'd just turn into another battle, limiting how often Linda and Chloe could drop by, and reclaiming my space in my own home. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension, but I was slowly learning to stand up for myself. I also began to reconnect with my own friends, something I'd neglected in the chaos of trying to please Mark's family. I started going to yoga classes with my friend Sarah, who'd been my college roommate. We'd grab coffee afterward and talk about everything from work to relationships, and it felt like a breath of fresh air. For so long, I'd been wrapped up in Mark's world, trying to fit into his family's expectations, that I'd forgotten what it was like to just be me. Mark and I began to rebuild our relationship, focusing on us instead of constantly catering to his family's demands. We started going to couples therapy, working through the damage that had been done and finding ways to communicate better. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. Despite the progress we were making, Linda and Chloe didn't back down easily. They were used to having control, and my newfound assertiveness didn't sit well with them. There were still snide comments, passive-aggressive remarks, and attempts to undermine the boundaries we'd set. The final showdown came when Mark and I decided to take a much-needed vacation, a week in the mountains, away from all the noise and stress. We were excited to reconnect, to spend some quality time together without any outside interference. But, of course, Linda and Chloe had other plans. 2 days before we were set to leave, Linda called, insisting that Mark come over to fix a plumbing emergency at her house. I knew it was another ploy to keep us from going, but Mark, ever the dutiful son, felt obligated to help. He promised it would only take an hour, but as the afternoon dragged on, it became clear that Linda was using the situation to keep him there. I was furious. This was our time, and once again, Linda was inserting herself into our plans. I decided to drive over to her house, determined to put an end to this once and for all. When I arrived, I found Mark in the basement, tinkering with the pipes while Linda hovered over him, giving instructions. "Mark, we need to go," I said, my voice firm but calm. "This isn't an emergency. It's just another way to control us." Linda turned to me, her face twisted with indignation. "You have no right to talk to him like that," she snapped. "I'm his mother. If I need help, he's going to help me. I'd had enough. No, Linda. You're not going to keep manipulating us like this, I said, standing my ground. This is exactly why we've been setting boundaries. Mark isn't your handyman, and we're not going to keep letting you dictate our lives. Mark, to my surprise, backed me up. Mom, Emily's right, he said, putting down his tools. This can wait. I'm tired of you trying to control everything. We're leaving. Linda looked shocked, as if she couldn't believe that her son was finally standing up to her. Chloe, who had been watching from the stairs, jumped in, trying to guilt Mark into staying. Wow, you're really just going to leave your family behind, she sneered. I guess we know where your priorities lie. But Mark didn't waver. We left, and as we drove away, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. It wasn't easy standing up to his family, but it was necessary. I knew that things would be strained for a while, but I also knew that we were finally on the right path. That night, Mark and I talked for hours, reflecting on everything that had happened. He admitted that he'd spent so long trying to keep everyone happy that he hadn't realized how much it was costing us. I'm sorry, Emily, he said, his voice heavy with regret. I should have stood up for us sooner. I squeezed his hand, grateful that he was finally seeing things from my perspective. We're in this together, I said. But we have to put us first. After the confrontation with Linda and Chloe, things were tense, but there was also a sense of relief. Mark and I finally had the space to focus on our relationship, to figure out what we wanted without the constant pressure from his family. Our vacation in the mountains was exactly what we needed, a chance to reconnect, talk openly, and enjoy each other's company without any distractions. We spent our days hiking, exploring the beautiful scenery, and having long, honest conversations about our future. For the first time in a long time, it felt like we were on the same page. We talked about our dreams, our fears, and what we needed from each other to make our marriage work. It wasn't easy, but it was a start. When we returned home, we continued to prioritize our boundaries. Mark set firm rules with his mom and sister: no more unannounced visits, no more meddling in our decisions, and no more guilt trips. It was a tough adjustment, and Linda and Chloe pushed back, but Mark held his ground. Linda tried to test the boundaries in small ways, inviting us over for dinner and then turning it into a lecture about how families should stick together, or accidentally dropping by when she was in the neighborhood. But each time, Mark and I stood firm. We politely but firmly reminded her of the boundaries we'd set, and slowly, Linda began to back off. Chloe, on the other hand, remained distant. She never apologized for her behavior, and while we were civil at family gatherings, the bond between us was forever changed. She continued to make passive-aggressive comments whenever she had the chance, but I no longer let them get to me. I realized that Chloe's behavior was more about her own insecurities than anything I'd done, and I stopped letting her words have power over me. Mark and I took things at our own pace, finally feeling free to make decisions without outside interference. We spent more time focusing on each other, planning little weekend getaways and finding new hobbies to enjoy together. We talked about having kids, but this time, it was on our terms, not because of pressure from anyone else. It wasn't a perfect ending. There were still moments of tension, and Linda and Chloe's influence would always be a part of our lives. But for the first time, I felt like I had a say in my own story. I wasn't just Mark's wife, I was my own person, and I was reclaiming the parts of myself that I'd lost along the way. I started to see a therapist, someone who helped me work through the lingering resentment and the guilt I'd felt for so long. I learned that it was okay to set boundaries, that I didn't have to apologize for wanting to protect my peace. I began to rediscover my own identity outside of being Mark's wife or Linda's daughter-in-law, and it was liberating. I also found a new passion in painting, something I'd dabbled in during college but had long forgotten. I set up a small art studio in the spare bedroom, filling the space with canvases, brushes, and bright, bold colors. Painting became my escape, a way to express everything I'd been holding in. Each brushstroke was a reminder that I was in control of my own life, and I didn't need anyone's approval to be happy. Mark encouraged me every step of the way, often joining me in the studio to watch or even paint alongside me. It was our little sanctuary, a place where we could just be ourselves without the weight of everyone else's expectations. We'd put on music, pour a glass of wine, and lose ourselves in the process of creating something new. It wasn't just about the art, it was about reclaiming our joy and finding beauty in the midst of chaos. Final update: moving forward, embracing new beginnings. Now, at 35, I'm in a place I never thought I'd be: stronger, more assertive, and finally at peace with the life I'm building. Mark and I are closer than ever, and while his family will always be a part of our lives, they no longer have the power to dictate our happiness. I've learned that setting boundaries isn't just about keeping people out, it's about making room for yourself, for your needs, and for your own peace of mind. It's not easy, especially when it involves family, but it's necessary. I've stopped apologizing for taking up space, for speaking my truth, and for demanding the respect I deserve. Linda and Chloe have slowly started to adjust to the new dynamic, though it's still a work in progress. We still attend family gatherings, but now I go in with a sense of confidence, knowing that I'm no longer willing to bend over backward to please them. Mark and I have created a safe space within our relationship, one where we can talk openly about our frustrations and support each other without judgment. We're still taking things one day at a time, but we're no longer afraid to put ourselves first. We've started planning a road trip across the country, something we've always dreamed of but never took the time to do. It's our way of embracing the freedom we've fought so hard to create, and I can't wait to see where this next chapter takes us. To anyone out there struggling with toxic family dynamics, know that it's okay to stand up for yourself. It's okay to set boundaries, to say no, and to prioritize your own well-being. You don't owe anyone your happiness, and you have the right to live your life on your own terms. Thank you for listening, Reddit. I'm still on this journey, but I'm proud of how far I've come. Here's to new beginnings, to finding strength in the face of adversity, and to embracing the life that's meant for you.